I'd like to introduce everyone to Chloé Fandel, who is an assistant professor in the geology department at Carleton. Chloé teaches classes on hydro, fluvial geomorph, and introductory geology. Chloé studies groundwater flow in karst regions, including some really cool places that Chloé has shown me, and in working landscapes. Chloé is also a scientific illustrator with work appearing in textbooks, public signage, and peer-reviewed publications. So take it away, Chloé.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I'm just gonna get right to the point, which is that we surveyed over 300 springs across the entire driftless area in 2025. And the goal was to get a regional snapshot of groundwater flow and groundwater quality. This is kind of a highlight of some of the ones that we visited. And I thought I would start by defining the driftless area because I know that people have some feelings about what counts. So for this project, we're using the boundaries defined by the Wisconsin survey. The true driftless area is on the eastern side of the Mississippi. It wasn't ever glaciated and it has no glacial drift. The driftless style area is on the west side of the Mississippi. It did get glaciated, but not during any of the most recent glaciations. And I like this map because it's showing slope, not elevation. So the darker colors mean steeper topography. And what it really highlights to me is that the driftless style area looks and feels really similar to the true driftless area. And both of them look really, really different from the rest of the Midwest, which is a lot flatter. So for this talk, I'm going to refer to them both together as the driftless area because they're more similar to each other than they are different. And then I'll highlight some specific factors where which side of the Mississippi you're on does matter. So why did we do this? We chose to study springs because they're fed by groundwater. Groundwater is where most of the drinking water comes from in the driftless area. And I'm sure a lot of you know all about this. There's been a lot of increasing concern in the news about nitrate contamination causing health issues, water levels dropping in wells. A lot of people worry that if there's nitrate in the water, there might be other contaminants that are harder to test for, like pesticides and microplastics and PFAS and pharmaceuticals. And if we want to work on this problem, we have to understand how groundwater systems behave. And springs can help us understand groundwater systems because they're the hydrogeologic equivalent of outcrops. Like, I really like this way of thinking about springs. So they concentrate flow from their entire recharge area, and then they discharge it at the surface at one point. And that point is usually relatively easy to access and measure. And so measurements that you take at springs have a really high informativeness value relative to their difficulty of acquisition, which makes them interesting. The other reason that I wanted to study springs is because they often support various rare or interesting or significant ecosystems. Economically, the one that matters the most is trout streams. They're a big regional economic driver in the driftless area. But there's also things like algific talus slopes, which is what this is a picture of. They're these remnant habitats of the last ice age, and they have weird species like the Pleistocene snail that only exist in those pocket microhabitats. And those pockets are really interesting and important because as the climate warms up around us, those areas of more stable temperatures that are supported by springs can become what are called climate refugia. So they're places where organisms can retreat to during heat waves and ride out the heat wave and then radiate back out to the rest of the ecosystem. So finding the springs that have the most stable conditions is important because those might be the ones that we're most going to prioritize understanding and studying and protecting. I actually wasn't planning to do this project. I wanted to use existing data to build numerical models. I wanted to try projecting future land management scenarios and seeing how they impacted groundwater levels and temperatures and contamination levels. And I thought that I could use existing spring data, which is what this map is showing, I had these really basic questions about boundary conditions and spatial patterns. And I started trying to compile a database of known springs across the Driftless area. And then I really quickly realized that it was going to be a project in its own right. So this map is every spring that I could find a record of. They're color-coded by where the data came from. And the quality and quantity of data available for each spring is really, really variable. I'm going to kind of run through some of the big data sources. The Minnesota Spring Inventory is fantastic. It's regularly updated. It's a mix of citizen-reported springs and field-verified springs. So where like a hydrogeologist went out and checked that it's really a spring and it's not a tile drain. That database does have a lot of false positives. Things that aren't really springs, but that citizens reported. But it's very dense in terms of a lot of data. The Wisconsin Spring Inventory, which is in green, there's two. In 2007, they did something kind of similar to the Minnesota Spring Inventory. So they just tried to capture everything, but with like pretty minimal quality control. And then in 2019, they picked springs over 0.25 cubic feet per second in terms of flow. And for those springs that are in dark green, they collected standardized data according to a standardized protocol. And that includes flow and sort of basic chemistry parameters. And then all of the oranges and yellows are county level inventories. And those are really variable. The Joe Davies County inventory in Illinois down here, they have really detailed chemistry for every single spring, but no flow data. And then all of these yellow springs are from 3 counties in Iowa. Those are mostly location. Sometimes they have a visual estimate of flow. And then everything else I filled in from doing a search of existing publications that mentioned springs, which are the black dots. I contacted local land managers and asked if they knew about any springs in their areas. And then I spent a bunch of time looking at topographic maps and place name databases. If you don't know about the geographic naming information system, it's really fantastic. And identifying places that were likely to be springs. So I put together this big database. There are a little over 3,000 springs. But this time, this map is color-coded by whether or not they're field verified. So the hollow circles are springs that somebody reported there was probably a spring there, but nobody has been out to check if it's really there. So only about a third of the springs are field verified. And then of those, a little over 900 have flow data. That could be just a visual estimate. And then a little over 300 have conductivity data or other chemistry or like more detailed information. And where I really hit a barrier with using this data is that it spans decades. So in this case, the color of the dot is showing the decade in which the spring was surveyed. And some of these springs are actually even earlier than this. The oldest one in the database is from 1912. And that makes it really hard to know if differences between spring characteristics are because of changes over time. Like maybe some springs were surveyed in a wet year and some springs were surveyed in a dry year. Or if it's because the springs really truly are fundamentally like hydrogeologically different. And then the last thing is that the field verified springs are not all evenly distributed. They're mostly in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Iowa has a big, huge area with a lot of springs that aren't field verified at all. So I thought it would be a good idea to go collect my own standardized field data. The little blue dots are all the springs I just talked about. And then the big black dots are the springs that we surveyed in 2025. There are 302. And the goal wasn't at all to survey all the springs in an area. What we wanted to do was survey a representative sample over a short time window using standardized methods. The time windows that I chose were intended to capture winter base flow, this blue bar, and then summer base flow, this green bar. when most of the spring's flow is coming from groundwater and there's minimal input from surface water. This is a time series of temperature in purple and flow in blue from Bear Spring, which is one of only 3 springs in the entire study area where I could find continuous monitoring data. So in this case, this is John Barry and Peter Kong, who are working on this spring and recording continuous data. And you can see what I was aiming for is that the survey windows are capturing like as stable conditions as possible and avoiding the sort of early spring, early summer variable snowmelt and storms. And then in the summer, it's a little bit trickier because there's punctual storms. So during both survey windows, if there was something that might cause a recharge event, like in the winter, warm days that would make snowmelt, or in the summer, like a big storm, we didn't survey during that period or the couple days afterwards to try to avoid these spikes. And I also wanted to make sure that we surveyed mostly the same springs in both winter and summer so that we could capture seasonal variation in the base flow, not seasonal variation due to recharge events. So the blue dots are springs we only surveyed in the winter. The green dots are springs we only surveyed in the summer, and then the black dots are those ones where we were successfully able to survey them in both winter and summer. We tried to use standardized protocols, so we used the same equipment. This is our summer survey kit on the left, and then we used the same field protocol. This is an example of a filled out survey sheet for a spring. At each spring, we recorded contextual information, so like date, time, location, detailed access notes so that we could find it again, spring type, land cover, lithology, aspect, hydrologic conditions, so like how many days since the last potential recharge event. We took photos, we drew sketch maps of what the spring area looked like. We wrote a bunch of qualitative observations, including if we were able to talk to the landowner or the land manager, we sort of asked them for like an oral history of the spring. And then we recorded quantitative measurements of physical and chemical parameters. So discharge, temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, nitrate. And then at about a quarter of the springs, we collected samples for major ion chemistry and for more accurate lab nitrate concentrations and for tritium. And then in between each site, we cleaned and disinfected anything that had come into contact with spring water to avoid spreading invasive species or aquatic pathogens. In the winter, finding the springs was really easy. If you've got liquid water and it's -20, it's a spring, usually. Much easier to access because there was much less vegetation obscuring them. The ground was frozen solid, so it's easy to walk on. I would, if any of you are thinking about doing springs work, I would do it in the winter if I weren't limited by student availability, for sure. Challenges of working in the winter. I'm from Arizona, so I had a lot of things to learn about winter field work. I am wearing like 4 layers of wool and 2 layers of down and a full body snowsuit inside waders. And then we had to add some special winter equipment. We taped hand warmers onto all the instruments so that they wouldn't freeze. And then a really crucial piece of winter field equipment that I was not expecting is a hair dryer. If you walk in water and then you walk in below freezing weather, your boots freeze onto your feet and then you can't get them off unless you blow dry them to melt, which was fun and exciting. And then for flow measurements, that was the most complex measurement to take. We tried to use the highest accuracy method that was possible at a spring. So velocity area method was the preferred method. I don't have a photo of that. If we couldn't do that, we did a salt dilution, which is what this is a photo of. If we couldn't do that, we did a bucket. And then if we couldn't directly measure the flow, we made a visual estimate, and then we noted that. And then we also calibrated our field probes once a week to try to make sure they were as accurate as possible. In the summer, much easier to recruit student field crews, longer days, nicer weather. We were able to do a lot of our surveying by kayak, which was great. much easier than on foot, not possible in the winter. But it was a lot more challenging to find springs and to access them. And we ran into a lot of unpleasant vegetation and insects and corn. So there are definitely some downsides to summer surveying also. Okay, so that's kind of what we did. And then I'm going to show you some results. I would like to really emphasize that we just finished organizing and quality or checking our data like last week. So these are really preliminary results. I would say low confidence because I haven't had the chance to go like quality check the analysis yet. And I would love questions about it at the end because again, it's like very preliminary. So just a like big picture overview of kinds of springs. You can classify springs by their sphere of discharge. Most of the springs we surveyed were rheocrene, which means they're flowing out into a channel, usually at the base of a slope. The next most common type was hill slope, where they're coming out partway up a slope. And then a small number of springs were things like limnocrene, where they come up into the bottom of a lake, helocrene, where they come out into a wetland, or the prettiest kind are gushet springs, where they come out of a tubular orifice in a cliff, and they make like a really nice waterfall. And then some of the springs were multiple types, or they were captured and we couldn't tell what the original type had been. We also recorded the orifice morphology, so like tubular, basically coming out of a conduit, fracture coming out of like a planar feature, sand boil where there's upward flow coming through like a sandy substrate. And really importantly, we measured the wetted orifice area, like the area that was actively flowing, so that later we could calculate the spring flux, which is the flow rate divided by the orifice area. And I'm going to talk more about that later. We also noted disturbances. Most springs had some kind of disturbance. Things like spring houses, dams, culverts, trash, livestock trampling. I think this really reflects how much humans are attracted to springs. Many springs showed some evidence of humans using them in the past for drinking water, powering a water wheel, watering livestock, refrigeration, things like that. And then another thing that really stood out in the winter was the importance of springs to animals. In the wintertime, nearly every spring had networks of animal tracks converging on the spring from all directions. And I think that's because they're sources of unfrozen drinking water and they're a little warmer and there's green plant food when everything else is dormant. A really surprising to me number of springs that we visited in the winter had pretty fresh looking animal carcasses, mostly deer and coyote and raccoon. And my guess is that animals that were stressed by the winter came to find the like more gentle climate around the spring and ended up dying there. Okay, kind of shifting to like the geologic setting of the springs. I think it's helpful to zoom out a little bit to look at the regional bedrock geology. This is the new USGS Cooperative National Map. It's amazing. If you haven't looked at it yet, I highly recommend. The thing to note here is that these are mostly marine sedimentary rocks, and as you move northeast, they're getting progressively older, and the bedrock is really dissected in the Driftless Area. And in some cases, you even have Precambrian basement poking through, like in the Baraboo Hills. If you layer in the superficial geology, so all of these lighter yellows and greens are superficial deposits, the Driftless Area really pops out in terms of the exposed bedrock. And you can see the difference between the true driftless, which has very little superficial sediment, and the driftless style area where there are some superficial deposits on top of the bedrock. So if we look at just the bedrock geology, again, the blue dots are the locations of the surveyed springs. I chose springs to survey to try to represent all the major bedrock units. And then on the left is the regional stratigraphy. We took Tony's amazing Minnesota stratigraphic column, and we added in the Silurian units, which are down here, mostly in Iowa, a little bit in Illinois. And I was hoping to have this done for this talk and didn't quite get to it, but I'm working on plotting the springs on the stratigraphic column so that you can visualize their stratigraphic position better. But just from the map, you can see that a lot of springs are coming out of the Ordovician carbonates, especially in the upper Ordovician, especially in this area that a lot of them are popping out just above the Decorah Shale. And then as you move closer to the Mississippi River Valley and as you go northeast, more and more of them are coming out from sandstones lower down in the stratigraphy. I thought it was helpful to visualize this as sort of like a simplified block diagram. So this is the front of the block diagram is along this cross-section line. And what it really highlights is that the bedrock isn't flat. It's dipping southwest very gently. And you have, that makes these cuestas with these sort of like flat-ish carbonate plateaus in the western and southern parts. And then they sort of step down a series of escarpments towards the Mississippi River Valley and towards the Wisconsin River Valley. And then in the northwest part, you have much more dissected topography with the older Cambrian sandstones more exposed, and you have these more sort of like isolated hilltops and ridges that are capped by carbonates rather than big, thick carbonate plateaus. I was aiming to survey springs across all the major rock types, not just stratigraphic units. And especially, I really wanted to make sure that we surveyed springs that were emerging from sandstones in the driftless style area and springs that were emerging from carbonates in the true driftless area, because I'm hoping to try to untangle the influence of lithology and stratigraphic position from the influence of whether a spring is in the true driftless versus the driftless style area. I'm going to go through just a few selected quantitative parameters. Flow rate is kind of one of the big interesting ones for me. This map is showing flow rate in the winter. The size of the dot is the flow rate, and then this is a density plot. It's like a histogram that's smoothed so that the bin size doesn't affect how the data shows up. And it's showing like essentially like how many of the springs are at each discharge. And so what it's really highlighting is that most of the springs have pretty low discharges, and very few springs have flow over 5 cubic feet per second. If we look at the summer data, flows, so now this is showing the same density plot has winter data in light blue and summer data in dark blue. And then the map is showing all of the summer springs discharge. Generally, flows were higher in the summer, which makes sense. We had a relatively wet spring. And nearly all of the highest flow springs are coming out from upper Ordovician units along this northwest southeast line that kind of wraps around. This is called Military Ridge in Wisconsin. And the dips kind of shift more to the south here. The biggest spring in the entire area is called Big Spring. It's in Iowa. It was flowing at over 80 cubic feet per second, which is nearly 4 times more than any other spring in the survey. So we didn't even put it on the density plot because it skewed the visualization so much. And I wanted to make a brief public service announcement. If you are ever in the position of naming a spring, I would like you to please not name it Big Spring, Cold Spring, Trout Spring. We must have at least 10 of each of those in our survey. This is the only one that I think is allowed to be called Big Spring. We also looked at the seasonal change in flow. So in this case, the size of the dot is the percent change in flow from winter to summer. Blue means the flow increased, red means the flow decreased. Most of the springs increased. And then what I thought was interesting is that most of the springs that vary a lot seasonally are also in these carbonate plateaus, and the springs that are more stable tend to be sort of more in the dissected parts and lower down in the stratigraphy. I would expect that things like the spring temperature and chemistry would be more variable at the springs that have more variable flow. I haven't gotten to that step yet, but it's interesting to look at because again, like the springs that have low variability might be the ones that will be able to support higher quality habitat going forwards, and so maybe be higher priority for possible protection. We also calculated the spring flux. So this is a metric that Sue Swanson at the Wisconsin survey came up with. It's the flow rate divided by the orifice area. And it's kind of a measure of how focused the spring discharge is. And discharge doesn't really correlate to flux. So the springs that were the highest flux, like the most focused flow, are really not necessarily the springs with the highest discharge. But Sue found that in Wisconsin, the spring flux correlated pretty strongly with what substrates and what organisms are present near the orifice. And so they had a big impact on the biology near the spring. And I'd like to see that if that holds true for our data set, and if it holds true across seasons. My guess is that even if the flow changes seasonally, I don't think the flux would. So that is sort of on my to-do list. And then in terms of chemistry, I'm just going to highlight a few key parameters. Nitrate concentration. So the map is showing summer nitrate concentration. The density plot is showing summer in darker colors and winter in lighter colors. Nitrate concentrations are really noticeably higher on the western side of the Mississippi, especially in the carbonate plateaus. As you get closer to the Mississippi River and as you go into the Wisconsin side, they're lower. I think that this is probably in part because as you move eastwards, there are more springs coming from sandstones deeper in the stratigraphy, but it also might be because the more dissected topography in this area is less conducive to large-scale intensive row cropping. And so there might be lower overall rates of fertilizer application per unit area here. Also, nitrate was generally a little bit higher in the winter than in the summer, which I think makes sense because there's not any plant activity in the winter to absorb it, and there's no potential for dilution from rainwater. Temperature, this is wintertime temperature, and then I'm just going to show you summertime temperature right away afterwards. The thing that stood out to me is that many, many springs had 0 temperature change at all from winter to summer. And then the springs that did change, the density plot comparing summer to winter is basically a mirror image. And the springs that had warmer summer temperatures almost always were the same as the ones that had colder winter temperatures. And so I think that means they are more influenced by surface conditions. Specific conductance, slightly lower in the summer than in the winter. I think probably because in winter, a higher proportion of the flow is older groundwater and there's less dilution from younger, lower conductivity recharge. Also, the conductivity was generally lower in sandstones than in carbonates, and it was the lowest at springs coming out of the Baraboo quartzite. And then at about a quarter of the springs, we collected water samples. This is showing which springs we sampled in which seasons. It's kind of complicated, so we're not going to really spend too much time on it. I'm going to start with nitrate. So this is showing winter and summer. On the x-axis is the nitrate that we measured at the spring using a field probe. And then on the y-axis is the nitrate from the sample that we sent to the University of Minnesota, which uses ion chromatography. And I was really interested in this data because I didn't totally trust our field probe. So if the field probe and the lab analyses had given exactly the same nitrate concentration, they should plot on this one-to-one line. They don't. And that tells us that the field probes in both winter and summer slightly underestimate nitrate. But helpfully, I used this line of best fit to calculate a corrected field nitrate value for all the springs where we didn't take samples and we were only able to measure with the field probe. So if anybody's using this kind of probe, this is a helpful thing to do. I also I sent duplicate nitrate samples to Fillmore County, comparing the results you get by ion chromatography with the results you get by spectrophotometry. They agree pretty well. There are a few outliers, and we're excluding those from any more analysis. And then the last thing I did with the nitrate analyses is that I was kind of worried that because we had a limited ability to ship samples from the field, we kept them on ice in coolers until the end of the field season, and then we shipped them all at once. And I was worried that the longer the storage time, the more error there would be in the nitrate measurement. And so I plotted the percent error comparing the field nitrate to the lab nitrate against the number of days that the sample spent in storage. And happily, there's no significant trend. So I think that means the increased storage time didn't increase the error, which is great. The only major ion I'm going to focus on is chloride. I have maps like this for every other one, but you don't want to see 27 maps. Chloride's really variable across the region. The three springs I just want to mention as sort of examples are the three highest chloride ones. This one is in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. It is right near a big abandoned mine complex, and so I think maybe it's receiving drainage from the abandoned mine shafts. This one is right near I-90, and so I think it's maybe receiving a lot of road salt. And then that one is just below a wastewater treatment plant, and so maybe it's receiving some leakage from that. And those are kind of like examples of things that can cause higher chloride in springs from surface influences. One of my students took the major ion data and plotted it on Piper diagrams for her senior thesis. They're a way to represent the relative ionic composition of a water sample. So each dot on the diagram is one spring, and they're color-coded by stratigraphic position. This is in order from youngest to oldest. And I was curious whether the springs would cluster by stratigraphic unit. They don't really, they mostly plot in one big cluster. It is interesting to me that all of the outliers are coming out of sandstones. And my interpretation of this that I don't feel confident about at all and would be happy to be told otherwise is that either the water coming from the springs has a residence time that's too short for it to come into chemical equilibrium with the source aquifer, or that there's enough mixing across aquifers that it obscures any kind of individual aquifer fingerprinting, or that the bedrock composition across the aquifers is so similar that there's no distinguishable signature across aquifers. And we also compare this to some previous studies looking at plotting well water samples from different aquifers on Piper diagrams. And the well samples plotted in a similar position and similarly clustered. So I think that makes sense. And then the last thing that we did, a different student used the tritium data that we collected to calculate the groundwater age. So in the winter season, we sampled 49 springs for tritium. I specifically chose the winter season because I thought it would have the highest proportion of older groundwater emerging in the spring flow. And I specifically emphasized choosing springs that were lower in the stratigraphy that I thought might be more likely to have older groundwater ages. And so my student calculated thresholds for pre-modern and modern and mixed groundwater ages, and she found that all of the springs were modern. So they have groundwater ages. They were recharged after 1952. And based on other studies, especially Tony's nice paper using allichlor, it's probable that many of them actually have much younger ages. But I thought it was interesting to note that none of them are older. And that means that even in the worst case scenario with the longest possible residence time, changes in human behavior at the surface would have an effect within a human lifespan, which I think is like motivating for people. I'm gonna stop there and sort of tell you what we're doing next. We just finished organizing and quality checking the data. Our next step is to make that public with accompanying report. And then we're gonna dig into more in-depth analysis. I'm interested in trying principal component analysis to try to untangle like what are the factors that influence the nitrate concentrations and the stability of the springs, and what's the role of stratigraphy and structure and topography, and then maybe choose some springs for long-term monitoring. Before I take questions, I want to just acknowledge that this was a massive project. I had a lot of help I had so much help that I had to make the font very tiny to put it all in this slide. So I'm not going to read off all the names, but I'm very grateful. And I'm especially grateful to my field crews. They were fantastic. And the students are going to be presenting a more detailed version of this work with more analysis at the Minnesota Groundwater Association conference in April. So if you want to hear more, you should go talk to them. And if any of you are looking for future interns and employees, I put them through the ringer and I can confirm this is an especially good batch. So if you're interested, let me know. And then I will take questions.
Chloe, that was awesome.